So you might be wondering what I mean by an engineering approach and why I would boast about engineering approaches. So I do work in the library, but I'm actually a trained engineer. Both of my degrees are from engineering, so I do feel comfortable making some assertions about how engineers think. And one thing I need to point out, if you were at the session right before this one, there was one of the university presses that are being funded by the Mellon Foundation to do work that actually could have very important relevance around what we're doing. But this is not a $1 million-ish grant-funded infrastructure effort. This is a prototyping effort with an ACLS fellowship for Kim, and we're leveraging one of the other projects that I lead called RMAP, which I'll talk about, and really the grit and the sweat of people like Elizabeth, Greg, me, and my colleagues in the library. We're not working off of a large-scale effort here. So a little bit about the engineering approach. My advisor in graduate school one day surprised me when he talked about engineering. And he said, well, you know, engineering is actually a liberal art. And I thought, okay, not sure what you mean by that. But he said, get beyond the science and the math and all those things. Those are methods. Those are the methods that engineers use. Don't get caught up in that. Engineering is about people, processes, and products, and the workflows that connect them. That's what I want you to take away from what an engineer does, what an engineer should do. So that's what I'm trying to convey with this diagram. It's that there are people involved in doing something, building something, thinking about something, so on. There are certain processes that those people use in order to get to their goal, and then the goal typically, from an engineering perspective, is some sort of product. But there are a massive number of workflows associated with all three of those components. And typically what happens in many cases is people hone in right on the product. But the product is actually the very end of all of these workflows. So I'd mentioned that I'm an engineer by training. My first undergraduate degree is in civil engineering. And I had the pleasure of visiting Doha not that long ago in Qatar. And if you've ever been there or seen pictures of Doha, it is a beautiful place from an architectural perspective. One of the people that lived there joked that Doha is like an architectural contest and everybody won. So it is just phenomenal to see the kind of structures that exist there. But with my engineering hat on, my first thought was, what pain it must have been to build those things. Because when you look at those structures, they are beautiful, they're elegant. One of them looks like it's floating, one of them looks like it's made of glass. As an engineer, they must have thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And this is a classic story between architects and engineers who basically have the same goal, right? They're working toward the same thing. But in some cases, what tends to happen is the architect shows up, and the joke in engineering school is they talk about this building floating in the sky, now go build it. And then engineers get their hands on it and they do things like put a column down the middle of the room, right? So if you only focus on the product, you're probably going to end up with a mess. You're probably either going to end up with something that is not easy to do or something that really isn't very elegant and inspiring and compelling. So architects and engineers work with the building owners and so on throughout an iterative process. You don't show up with a blueprint and say, go build this. You all work together to build that blueprint. I think the same thing is true of libraries and presses and publishers and the authors. We typically think, is it a PDF? Is it an EPUB? Is it an HTML file? In my view, that's missing the point. You've gone right to the product. And what may happen is the software developer working with is Mark Cizik, as Kim mentioned. He's a very smart guy, very innovative guy. He comes up with a lot of interesting ideas that he shares with me. And over time, what's basically happened is I've said, Mark, we have to be able to work with the press, right? So you might do something really amazing, but if it doesn't work with whatever systems and workflows they have, you're actually creating a problem for them. You're giving them that building in the sky. And presses, maybe the University of Michigan aside, don't necessarily think about preservation issues right up front. So it's a very important question about whether you embed a video file in EPUB or you leave that video file independently and assemble something into a container. I'll use that term. So those aren't necessarily things we think about as individual entities working on this same kind of effort. And it's very rare that you bring the author in. And I really want to applaud Kim because she really is the inspiration behind this. As she has said, she wants to see how the sausage is made. She wants to understand what the workflows are so that she can become more creative, the other authors can become more creative about what they hope to do and about what they hope to accomplish. So from the very beginning of this process, she's been engaged, the other authors are now engaged, and they're working together with us to conceptualize what this means. And this is a diagram only an engineer could love, and I do love it, believe me. Or maybe a software developer could love it too. But this is something our project manager came up with. And you can look at the details and you can look at the slide, but I'm not going to go through the slide, trust me. The most important thing is this is a harmonized view of the workflow. So what we did was the library went off and said, if we were to build a digital book, how would we do it? And then the press basically said, we have a workflow for how we produce our print books and the e-books that are a reflection of those print books. And then we sat down in the room together and we put the diagrams together. And we said, what does that look like? And the main point of this is that we're using the existing workflows for the press as the launching point for this innovative digital publication. So very explicitly, we are acknowledging that there's a process that JHU Press has to go through in order to produce its print books and then to produce its e-books that are associated with that. And we're going to use that EPUB at the end of that process as a launching point for this kind of innovative type of activity that we might do, or innovative products that we might develop. The interesting aspect of this is based on this discussion, basically Project said, if you have an EPUB that is an output of the JHU Press, we want it in Muse. So a lot of conversations might have gone around, could you do this? It would be really great if you did this and so on. It all came in naturally when they said, well, if it's a JHUP publication, then there's no question here. We actually need to be involved. So there's a natural alignment that leads partners to come to the table rather than trying to convince them to be part of something much broader. The one thing I will point out is the diagram. If you can look at the bottom EPUB, there's a book manuscript EPUB and then another EPUB file. That bottom layer, or sort of workflow, if you will, is where we see ourselves doing that innovative work, trying to think about different ways in which you can leverage and build upon the sort of standard EPUB format. And it is a very iterative process. The workflow development itself was iterative. Getting the authors involved at different stages will be iterative. And another couple of examples or anecdotes I'll share with you. So one of the things we did was ask, could you use the Open Monograph project to manage the workflow for this? And that's a perfectly good question from the library perspective. We sat down and looked at how things go. No, that doesn't make any sense. Now that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't sat down with the press and actually said, how do you actually do this? There is a naive, and I'll use that word very clearly and deliberately, perspective of the library that sure, you can just use OMP. It's a perfectly nice piece of software. Why can't you just use it? What we are doing is using Omeka as a content staging platform. So when the authors create content or identify new content, they're going to put it into Omeka as a staging place for us to work with. How many of you are familiar with linked data? All right, I'll give you the 5-second version. It's very important. It's happening now, and it will change the way we do things. That's it. This is, in linked data world, what's called an aggregation, or a container, if you prefer. What this is comes from a project called RMAP, something funded by the Sloan Foundation, where we are actually creating linked data graphs or aggregations that show connections between different kinds of content. So if you have an article or book and it cites a data set, which is produced by a particular kind of software, and you can see a video about this, these graphs basically show you those connections. And it's these graphs that we think are going to be at the heart of this innovative side of what we're doing. So another conversation we had with the authors and with the press was about sustainability. So the press is taking the courageous step of basically saying, we know these books in print format are not going to sell enough to make up the costs. And we will produce the ebooks, and we could put them out in open access form as well. How do we sustain this project? Because it's now actually a series. These first four books will be the first of a series. We had a very interesting conversation around pedagogical applications, and if we're going to stage the content in Omeka, maybe we can make exhibits, and maybe those exhibits can be sold or generate revenue, or maybe those exhibits can help foster greater sales of the books. Maybe there can be content in the books that don't exist in the digital form. All of these kinds of conversations can happen now in this context. So I live in Baltimore, and last year I was actually at the Project Muse meeting when the Freddie Gray riot started. And I drove home that night, and I saw my city on fire. And that's not something I'm ever going to forget. A year later, we are on pins and needles as these trials occur, and the verdicts are coming in. There's a lot of social media activity every time one of these trials happens and the verdict is issued. Why not try and leverage that social media interest in what's happening with potentially these books, with potentially these exhibits, with potentially all these different nodes that you see on the graphs. These graphs will allow us to make those connections and then ultimately make this a continuous effort. So it's not just iterative, but it's also continuous. This third branch, this third output is a continuous process for us. Now, we don't have a name for this product yet, and I think that tells us something about we're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. We wanted to come up with a code name, which is something software development projects do all the time. My software developer came up with Gus, which is not the best name in the world. Greg Britton came up with Benjamin Banneker, who was the first printer in Baltimore City, a freed slave who actually produced a series of almanacs and was a bit of a Renaissance man. So we're code naming it Banneker. And as we move forward with this project, we'll actually see what it looks like, and we'll come up with a name for the product itself. So I'll end with some acknowledgments here, but then Elizabeth's going to add the perspective from JHU Press.